The repeated spectacle of desperate individuals navigating treacherous waters towards these shores, only to be greeted by a cacophony of legal challenges, political hand-wringing, and spiraling public costs, forces a fundamental question upon us. What precisely has become of the modern sovereign state's capacity to define, let alone defend, its own borders? This isn't merely a debate about immigration policy. It is an interrogation into the very sinews of national identity, the integrity of legal frameworks, and the philosophical underpinnings of Western governance. The latest iteration of Britain's perpetual asylum confrontation, manifesting as yet another legislative attempt to assert control, immediately entangled in the intricate web of judicial review and international conventions, lays bare not just a procedural failure, but a profound structural contradiction at the heart of our political class. Why does a state, ostensibly in control of its destiny, find itself seemingly paralyzed by its own laws, traditions, and an increasingly vocal chorus of transnational advocacy, unable to enact a policy that reflects the overwhelming will of its citizenry? The observable news event, then, is not the small boats themselves, nor the latest parliamentary skirmish over a new piece of legislation, nor even the burgeoning expense of accommodating those who arrive. These are merely symptoms. The real story unfolds in the almost theatrical predictability of the cycle. A government announces a robust new measure, often with much fanfare and an air of decisive action. This measure is swiftly met with an injunction, a legal challenge from well-funded advocacy groups, or a stern pronouncement from an international body. The policy is then either watered down, delayed indefinitely, or struck down entirely, often on grounds that appear abstract and distant from the immediate reality of state control. This cycle isn't just frustrating. It represents a systematic undermining of democratic accountability, where the electorate's clear desire for managed borders is repeatedly thwarted by institutions operating on a different, arguably higher, set of principles. One must ask, what are the true political and institutional motivations driving this continuous charade? On the surface, the government expresses a clear intent to stop the boats and take back control, aligning with its electoral mandate. Yet, beneath this public posture lies a profound institutional timidity. There is a deep-seated fear within the political establishment of being perceived as inhumane, illiberal, or indeed violating a sacred, albeit vaguely defined, international legal order. This fear is not entirely irrational. It is assiduously cultivated by a powerful ecosystem of non-governmental organizations, activist lawyers, and significant segments of the media who wield humanitarian language as both a shield and a weapon. The government, therefore, finds itself in a strategic bind. It must be seen to act, but its actions must simultaneously navigate a labyrinth of moral and legal red lines, many of which are drawn not by its own parliament, but by external entities or historical precedents reinterpreted for contemporary effect. The political class is incentivized to pursue performative rather than genuinely effective solutions, to create an illusion of control while avoiding the truly difficult, confrontational decisions that would challenge the prevailing ideological consensus. This brings us to the core of the problem, the ideological constraints that paralyze any meaningful attempt at border enforcement. We have witnessed the capture of key institutions, elements of the judiciary, parts of the civil service, and indeed swathes of the media, by a post-national, indeed often anti-national, ideology. This ideology frames the assertion of national sovereignty over borders not as a legitimate act of self-preservation, but as a morally suspect, even racist endeavor. The prevailing narrative, meticulously constructed and relentlessly disseminated, posits that the West has an almost infinite capacity and an absolute moral obligation to absorb anyone who declares themselves an asylum seeker, regardless of the practicalities, the economic costs, or the social consequences. The language deployed in this discourse is particularly insidious. Terms like human rights, international law, and compassion are not merely descriptive. They have become prescriptive, serving as a rhetorical cudgel to bludgeon any dissent into silence, to question the expansive interpretation of refugee conventions, or to suggest that national interest might at times legitimately outweigh universalist aspirations, is to risk immediate excommunication from polite society. This linguistic capture effectively disables critical thought, replacing rigorous analysis with emotionally charged moralism. It fundamentally challenges the very notion of a bounded political community, positing that such boundaries are inherently unjustifiable in an interconnected world. The intellectual revelation here is stark. The problem is not merely a failure of policy implementation, but a profound ideological failure of nerve systemic reluctance within our elite institutions to articulate, let alone defend, the legitimate interests of the nation-state. The strategic consequences of this paralysis are dire and unfolding across multiple dimensions. Economically, the cost of this uncontrolled inflow, far from being a negligible externality, now runs into billions, not just for housing and processing, but for the wider strain on public services, healthcare, and education in areas already struggling. Socially, the constant arrival of individuals with no connection to the host culture, often settling in concentrations, places immense pressure on social cohesion and the integration process. This isn't abstract. It manifests in visible changes within communities, in growing distrust between the public and its governing institutions, and in the gradual erosion of a shared national identity. Furthermore, there are undeniable security implications. While many arrivals are genuinely vulnerable, the lack of robust vetting processes in chaotic situations inevitably creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by criminal elements or those with malign intent. To anyone paying attention, this outcome was as predictable as it was ignored by those who shaped the prevailing narrative. What happens when a society voluntarily creates an open-ended liability, both financial and social, without any clear mechanism for its termination or control? This predicament is not, as some would suggest, a historical anomaly. Instead, it is a chilling echo of deeper civilizational shifts. Throughout history, the rise and fall of empires, the strength of nations, has always been intimately tied to their ability to define and defend their physical and cultural boundaries. Rome, in its decline, struggled with managing its frontiers, grappling with internal decay and external pressures. The British Empire, ironically, maintained its vast global reach through an unwavering, though often brutal, assertion of its own sovereignty and interests. Today, we are witnessing a peculiar inversion, a nation blessed with a natural maritime border, behaving as if it has an endlessly porous land frontier, perpetually struggling against self-imposed constraints. The roots of this modern dilemma can be traced back to the post-World War II consensus and the subsequent development of international human rights law. While born of genuinely noble intentions to prevent future atrocities and protect the most vulnerable, these frameworks have expanded far beyond their original scope. What began as a means to protect specific persecuted minorities has metastasized into a universal entitlement that can be invoked by virtually anyone, anywhere, to demand entry into a prosperous Western state. This expansion, largely driven by judicial activism and an internationalist lobby, has fundamentally altered the relationship between the individual and the state, endowing the former with rights that can effectively trump the sovereign will of the latter. This represents a profound abdication of institutional responsibility by successive governments who have allowed these frameworks to ossify and expand without sufficient pushback or re-evaluation in light of contemporary challenges. The Enlightenment's legacy, intended to promote individual liberty and rational governance, has been distorted. Its universalist ideals, when untethered from the practical realities of statecraft and national identity, can, ironically, lead to a form of self-abnegation. The idea that all humanity is one, while a beautiful aspiration, becomes a destructive ideology when it demands the dissolution of the specific political units, nations, that have historically provided the framework for that very liberty and prosperity. The historical context reveals that this current impasse is not an unfortunate accident, but the logical culmination of decades of ideological drift, where a diffuse sense of guilt over historical injustices has been weaponized to disarm any robust defense of the national interest. The West, in its boundless capacity for self-criticism, has arrived at a point where the assertion of its own boundaries is deemed morally suspect, even as the global population pressures continue to mount. The long-term global and civilizational implications are profound. If a nation-state cannot control who enters its territory, can it truly be called a sovereign nation-state at all? The capacity of a democratic government to act upon the will of its people is fundamentally undermined when its legislative attempts are consistently nullified by unelected judges or international bodies. This fosters a deep and corrosive cynicism towards politics, a sense that the levers of power are no longer responsive to the citizenry, but instead beholden to an unaccountable elite or an abstract legal order. The consequence is not just a policy failure, but a crisis of legitimacy, a fraying of the social contract. This is not merely about Britain, it is a microcosm of a wider Western ailment. Many European nations grapple with identical challenges, facing similar legal and ideological constraints. The persistent failure to manage migration pressures in a sustainable and controlled manner risks accelerating the erosion of national identities, fostering societal fragmentation, and potentially leading to a dangerous backlash. What happens when the institutions built to protect us become the primary source of instability, repeatedly thwarting the very public they are meant to serve?
The prevailing border narrative, one of boundless compassion, limitless capacity, and a perpetual obligation to the world, is not merely mistaken, it is demonstrably false and strategically catastrophic. It shields the ruling class from accountability, allowing them to appear virtuous while presiding over chaos. It infantilizes the public, implying they are too unsophisticated or uncompassionate to grasp the supposed moral imperatives. And it systematically disables the state from fulfilling its most fundamental duty to protect its citizens and its territory. The latest Asylum Showdown, therefore, is not an isolated incident. It is another act in a long-running civilizational drama, a test of whether the West possesses the intellectual clarity and political will to reclaim its own destiny. Can societies built on the principles of self-determination and rule of law continue to function when those very principles are selectively applied, or indeed inverted, to achieve outcomes that few explicitly desire and none can sustainably manage? This isn't merely a question of how to manage a border. It is a question of whether Western nations will choose to remain coherent, self-governing entities, or whether they will passively acquiesce to a future where their boundaries, identities, and democratic mandates become increasingly blurred and ultimately irrelevant. What, then, does it mean for a society to voluntarily dismantle the very mechanisms designed for its preservation? And what legacy will this generation leave behind if it cannot even define its own boundaries, let alone defend them?